The morning sun had barely touched the quiet neighborhood when chaos erupted. A black man dressed in work clothes pressed the button to lift his garage door. He had no idea that his simple routine would soon turn into a spectacle. Across the street, a woman clutched her phone, her eyes wide with fury. To her, this wasn't a neighbor retrieving his car. It was a thief stealing her new vehicle. Within minutes, the sharp wail of sirens pierced the air. What began as one woman's suspicion would explode into a confrontation that exposed the raw, unspoken tensions simmering just beneath the surface of suburbia. Derek Johnson had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 6 years. A hard-working, mechanic and single father, he had saved every penny to finally purchase his dream car, a sleek black sedan with just the right mix of performance and reliability. For him, the car wasn't just transportation. It was proof of persistence, of late nights and long shifts that had finally paid off. Most mornings, Derek's routine was simple: get his young daughter ready for school, grab his lunch pail, and head out through the garage. His neighbors rarely noticed him. He kept to himself, polite but private, never one to stir trouble. But trouble found him. Across the street lived Karen Miller, a recent transplant to the neighborhood and self-proclaimed guardian of its standards. Known for her frequent complaints to the Homeowners Association, she seemed to see threats where others saw nothing at all. When she spotted Derek unlocking his garage that morning, her eyes zeroed in on the car inside. To her, it looked suspiciously like the one she had just purchased from a dealership a few miles away. Rather than asking questions or checking her facts, Karen made a snap judgment. The black man across the street was stealing cars. She dialed 911, her voice sharp and frantic, describing a crime in progress. As Derek hummed softly while gathering his tools and preparing to head to work, he was unaware that within minutes, police cruisers would barrel down his quiet street. He didn't know that his life, reputation, and safety were about to be thrust into jeopardy, all because of one woman's baseless assumption. The rumble of engines shattered the morning calm. Derek looked up from his tool bag just as 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt outside his driveway, lights flashing red and blue across the neat row of suburban homes. His first thought was confusion. Had there been an accident nearby? Was someone hurt? But the way the officers leapt from their vehicles, hands hovering near their holsters, told him otherwise. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here for him. Karen stood on her porch. Across the street, phone still clutched in her hand, her expression a mix of triumph and fear. She pointed toward Derek's garage, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. "That's him. That's the one stealing the car." Derek froze. His car sat right where it had been since he parked it the night before. Clean, polished, and legally his. Every paper, every payment, every signature on the purchase was in his name. But at that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing the officers saw was a black man beside a car and a frantic woman accusing him. The neighbors began to stir. Curtains parted. Doors creaked open. People peeked out, drawn by the flashing lights and the rising tension. Whispers rippled through the street. Derek's daughter, only 8 years old, peered out from the front door of their house, confusion etched on her small face. "Daddy?" she called softly. Derek's chest tightened. He raised a hand toward her, signaling to stay inside. His heart pounded, not for himself, but for her. The officers barked commands, their voices sharp and authoritative. Derek complied with every word, moving slowly, hands visible, his body trembling with a cocktail of anger and fear. He tried to speak, to explain that this was his house, his car, his life, but each attempt was cut short. Karen, meanwhile, continued her tirade, insisting she had just bought the same model, that this was proof of a theft ring in the neighborhood. To her, Derek's calm explanations and outstretched registration papers meant nothing. To the officers, her frantic accusations meant everything. The moment dragged on like an eternity. Derek's mind raced. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, how easily they could spiral into tragedy. Every muscle in his body screamed to shout, to demand justice, but his instincts told him to stay measured. His daughters, Frightened eyes from the doorway anchored him. As more neighbors gathered, murmurs began to rise. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others crossed their arms, siding silently with Karen. The scene had become more than an accusation. It was a spectacle, a judgment handed down in real time, with Derek caught in the middle. What began as a peaceful morning had transformed into a public trial, one where the jury was his own neighborhood, the prosecutor a woman who barely knew him, and the verdict still dangerously unclear. Just as the officers moved closer, Derek steadied himself and finally found his voice. Calm, but firm, he spoke over the noise. "The car is mine, the paperwork is inside, let me show you." One officer hesitated, his gaze flicking from Derek to the shiny black sedan. The tension hung thick, every movement deliberate, every second dangerous. Then, from the doorway, Derek's daughter cried out, clutching a folder in her hands. "Daddy, you forgot these!" she shouted, running forward before he could stop her. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the little girl, innocent and unaware of the danger, handed him the folder. Inside were neatly stacked documents: the bill of sale, the title, the financing, records, every page proof of Derek's rightful ownership. The officer nearest to him flipped through the paperwork, his brows furrowing. The dealership stamp gleamed fresh on the bill of sale. Derek's name was printed clearly, undeniably, across every line. Across the street, Karen's confident posture began to crumble. Her voice faltered. There must be some mistake. That looks just like the car I ordered. How could he? But her words fell flat, drowned out by the undeniable truth. The officers exchanged glances, the sharpness of their demeanor softening into shame. The tension in their stance eased, though the embarrassment hung, heavy. The spectacle that had begun with sirens and suspicion was unraveling, not with handcuffs but with proof of a man's honesty and a neighbor's baseless prejudice. Derek didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He simply stood tall, his daughter's hand in his, letting the truth speak louder than anything else. But in that silence, in that still moment, the weight of the injustice was clear to everyone, watching. Karen's accusation had collapsed, not just under the paperwork, but under the stark reality of what had been laid bare. A black man had to prove his innocence for simply opening his own garage. The flashing lights faded as the officers retreated, their apologies awkward and hollow. They packed their papers, offered stiff nods, and drove away, leaving behind the echo of sirens and the sting of humiliation. The crowd of neighbors lingered, some whispering, some shaking their heads, but none able to erase what they had just witnessed. Karen stood frozen on her porch, arms crossed tightly as though holding herself together. Her earlier confidence had drained from her face, replaced by something harder to mask: shame. But no apology came. She turned away, retreating into the safety of her home, the door slamming shut like a final act of denial. Derek knelt to his daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You were brave," he whispered, his voice low enough only for her to hear. She smiled weakly, clutching the now creased folder of papers like it was armor. For Derek, this wasn't a victory. The truth had set him free in that moment, yes, but the cost was heavy. He had been forced to defend his existence in front of his child, to prove ownership of what he had worked so hard to earn, all because one neighbor saw his skin color as a crime. In the days that followed, the incident spread quietly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors came forward with tentative apologies, awkwardly delivered at the mailbox or in passing. Others avoided eye contact altogether, their silence a different kind of confession. But there were also small shifts. Children waving to Derek's daughter at the bus stop, a neighbor offering to mow his lawn while he worked late. Small gestures that spoke of recognition, perhaps even remorse. Change didn't come in grand speeches or sweeping reforms. It came in cracks, tiny breaks in the wall of prejudice that had stood unchallenged for too long. Derek chose not to move away. He chose to stay, not out of stubbornness, but out of determination. His home, his car, his life, none of it needed validation from anyone else. And as the seasons changed, his presence became a quiet but unshakable reminder to those around him. Belonging isn't granted by neighbors' approval. It's claimed by right. For his daughter, the lesson was indelible. She had seen her father stand tall in the face of falsehood, seen the truth clear a path through suspicion. And when her teacher later asked the class to describe a hero, she didn't name a celebrity or an athlete. She spoke of her father, the man who faced down flashing lights and whispers, who taught her that dignity is something no one can take away, because at its core, the story wasn't about a car. It wasn't about paperwork, it was about visibility, about a man demanding to be seen not as a suspect but as who he truly was. And the question left hanging for every neighbor, every watcher, every listener was simple. How many more Derricks must prove their innocence before the world final